The lights flickered faintly in the dim corridor of the old hospital, casting dancing shadows on the peeling walls. The air was thick with a heavy silence, broken only by the subtle murmur of ancient machines and the occasional creak of the worn-out floorboards. On that misty night, the place seemed more like a nightmare setting than a healing center. Maria, a young nurse, was in charge of the night shift in the abandoned wing of the hospital. She walked through empty hallways, her flashlight swaying with the tremor of her nervous hands. The scent of mold and aged disinfectant filled the air, creating a suffocating atmosphere that enveloped everything like a macabre shroud. The nurse had heard legends about the haunted hospital, but she had always dismissed such stories as ridiculous superstitions. However, on that night, she began to question her rationality. Inaudible whispers echoed through the corridors, as if the walls held haunting memories within them. Every step Maria took was accompanied by a feeling of invisible eyes watching her from the shadows. As she approached the end of the corridor, she spotted a partially open door. A dim light emanated from inside, revealing a room filled with disheveled beds and abandoned medical equipment. Maria hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open slowly, creating a sharp creak that pierced the silence. The room was cold, and the flickering light cast dancing shadows on the peeling walls. Maria felt a chill run down her spine as she walked among the empty beds. It was then that she heard a soft sound, an indistinct murmur that echoed like a distant lament. The nurse forced a nervous smile, trying to ignore the feeling that something was amiss. Suddenly, the room's temperature seemed to plummet. Maria could see her breath forming white clouds in the air. Her eyes widened as she realized that the shadows of the beds were writhing, taking on indistinct forms of human figures. She blinked, hoping it was just her imagination. However, when she opened her eyes again, the shadows remained, now more defined. A figure emerged from the shadows, a silhouette dressed in the hospital nurse uniform. Maria tried to scream, but her throat felt frozen with fear. The ghostly nurse raised a thin, pale hand in a silent gesture, inviting Maria to approach. A primal instinct screamed at her to flee, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. The ethereal figure led Maria down a narrow corridor, where darkness closed in around her like a sinister cocoon. The mournful murmur grew in intensity, becoming almost deafening. Maria could feel invisible eyes fixed on her, watching every step she took. Finally, the ghostly nurse stopped in front of a partially open door. The room beyond it was shrouded in deeper shadows than any other part of the hospital. Maria's faltering steps were interrupted when she realized the room was not empty. Lying on the central bed was a patient, pale and motionless, with empty eyes that seemed to stare into the darkness. The ghostly nurse approached the bed with a supernatural grace. Her lifeless eyes, filled with sadness, met Maria's gaze. A voice whispered in the nurse's mind, a voice that seemed to come from beyond the grave. "I couldn't save any of them," lamented the ghostly nurse. "And now, I'm trapped here, condemned to relive the final moments of my patients for all eternity." Maria swallowed hard, feeling a tightness in her chest. The words of the ghostly nurse resonated in her mind, and she began to understand the tragedy that had unfolded there. The patient on the bed was no ordinary patient. He was the last in a long list of lost souls who had passed through that hospital. The ghostly nurse told Maria the gruesome story of how she had failed to save each patient, one by one. Her eyes filled with invisible tears as she described the horrific scenes of suffering and death she had witnessed. Maria felt the sadness and despair hanging in the air, enveloping her like a cold shroud. While listening to the story, Maria began to realize that the ghostly nurse was trapped in that place for a reason. Each patient she had failed to save carried with them a curse that bound their souls to the cold and empty hospital corridors. And now, Maria was part of that curse. The murmuring in Maria's mind grew in intensity, turning into a chorus of anguished voices. She found herself surrounded by writhing shadows, representing the ghosts of the lost patients. The ghostly nurse, looking at Maria with pleading eyes, whispered, "You can free us, nurse. You can break the curse." Maria was paralyzed, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. She felt the invisible hands of the ghosts surrounding her, begging for mercy. The room began to tremble, as if the hospital itself was groaning under the weight of years of unresolved suffering. It was then that Maria realized what she needed to do. With a courage she didn't know she possessed, she approached the patient on the central bed, reaching out to touch his cold forehead. A pulsating energy ran through her body, a mixture of sadness and redemption. "I release you," whispered Maria, her words echoing through the room. The ghostly nurse smiled, a smile of gratitude and relief. The shadows began to dissipate, the murmurs turning into sighs of liberation. However, as the shadows faded away, the room grew colder and darker. The ghostly nurse began to fade, her ethereal body becoming increasingly transparent. Before Maria could understand what was happening, the figure disappeared completely, leaving behind only the faint echo of her final breath. The room was now silent, except for the distant sound of the wind howling through the empty corridors. Maria was alone, surrounded by the darkness and coldness of the abandoned hospital. She had freed the lost souls, but at a terrible cost. The ghostly nurse had now joined the ranks of those she had failed to save. With shaky steps, Maria exited the room and walked through the dark corridors toward the exit. The hospital, now without the haunted shadows, seemed calmer, but the feeling of sadness persisted. Maria wondered if she too would become a ghostly nurse, condemned to wander the abandoned corridors forever. As she passed through the hospital gates, Maria looked back one last time. A cold breeze whispered between the decrepit buildings, as if the liberated souls were thanking her for their redemption. She walked away, leaving behind the haunted past of the hospital, but the weight of the experience would stay with her forever. That night, the hospital remained shrouded in silence, as if the walls had absorbed the tragic stories that unfolded there. The empty corridors witnessed the journey of a brave nurse who dared to confront the past and free the lost souls. However, the memory of the ghostly nurse would echo through the corridors, a somber reminder that not all stories have happy endings.